Hello, you're welcome to the channel. My name is Henry Onyebuchi, and this is Inside the App. Today, we have Solidity control structures, and we're going to be looking at loops. When writing smart contracts, we often need to repeat certain tasks multiple times, and this is where loops come in handy. The for loop is used to repeat a block of code a fixed number of times. It is used when you know the exact number of iterations you want to perform. The syntax of a for loop in Solidity looks as follows. So I'm going to define a function and call it for loop. I'm going to make it a public function. And then to show you how a for loop works, it starts with the for keyword and a bracket. At this point, we have the initialization of the loop. Next, we have the condition. And finally, we have the increment or decrement. And this is followed by a block of code, which carries the code to be executed in each iteration. So the initialization defines the starting point or the initial value of the loop variable, while the condition specifies the condition that must be true for the loop to continue executing. And finally, increment decrement determines how the loop variable should change after each iteration. So let's give a clear example of the for loop and how it works. Assuming we have a state variable that maps an address to a boolean, and let's just call it state. And let's say we want to have a function that can be able to set the state of multiple addresses. So using this our for loop function, I'm going to define an argument of an array type of addresses. So I'm going to use the memory keyword and I'm going to call it address list. Now to implement our for loop, I'm going to start by using the keyword for. For the initialization, I'm going to define a uint256 variable. I'll call it I, and I'll give that an initial value of 0. Next, for the condition, I want this iteration to keep happening so long as I is less than the length of the addresses that we pass in as an argument. So to get the length, I'm just going to access this .length variable available in arrays in Solidity, same thing as JavaScript. And then we need to increment or decrement. So I'm just going to increment I. So I++ is incrementation. I'll increment I by 1 whenever an iteration is complete. I'm going to follow up with the code block. So this is where we write the code that gets executed on every iteration. And I want to update the state of every address in the states variable. So I'm going to define a pointer to the state variable that we are trying to modify. And we're going to map it with the address that we are currently dealing with in this iteration. So I'm going to write address list, which is the parameter we passed in. And address list is an array. So I'm going to be dealing with the particular index of I at this point. And then I can map it to true. So one thing you need to know, the default value of a Boolean is false. So by default, every defined Boolean that isn't initiated with a value is known to be false. And so we have a function that iterates through a list of addresses and updates their states to true in the smart contract state variable. So I'm just going to quickly deploy this so we can test and see exactly how it works. So coming over here to Remix, I deploy. And now that we've deployed, you can see Remix provides us with a list of addresses here. So I'm just going to try to copy some addresses and see how we can use them. So the function takes in an input parameter of address arrays. So I'm going to pass in an array of addresses. So I copied the first address. I'm going to copy the second address that I want to use this for. So this is the second address. I'm going to copy a third address. So let's just make it 3 addresses in this array list. So I'll use this third one. And then the third address. So I'm trying to make all these addresses become true. Before I execute the for loop function, I'm just going to come here to confirm that they are currently false. As you can see, the first address as well is currently false on the statement. So I expect that when I make the smart contract call, all these addresses that I've passed in as a parameter will become true in the smart contract. And so when I transact, the function executes. You can see over here the three addresses will pass in the array list as parameters. So I can just check these individual addresses to know what their values currently are. So since I've made the call, I expect all these addresses to, in every iteration, to be set to true. So I can just check the value of this first address and I can see that it's now true. And also copy the second address to be sure that the same thing happened. When I post it, same address is true, and then the last address is true. And so you can see we've just created our first for loop function in Solidity, and we used it to make a list of addresses that will pass in as a parameter to become true in the state variable mapping that we have defined. So next, I'm going to show you while loop. The while loop is used to repeat a block of code while a certain condition is true. The syntax for while loop in Solidity is as follows. Now, contrary to the for loop, the while loop uses the keyword while, and as you can see, it only has a condition and a code block to be executed after every iteration. I'm going to define this in plain terms. So I'm going to start by defining a variable named I, a unit type variable named I, and then I'm going to write the while keyword, which takes a condition, and in our case, I want the condition to be I less than 5. And so to our code block, I don't want to do much. I'm only going to increment the value of I. I'm going to have our smart contract return that value of I after the while loop runs. That means I'm going to indicate in the function signature that it returns a uint 256 type of variable. And since this is a read-only function where we're not dealing with the state variable of the smart contract, we can restrict this to pure. So to explain the function here, I defined a variable called I, a uint256 type variable, and I didn't assign a value to it. And by default, the default value for uint256 is 0, so which means I is currently 0. And for our condition, we want this while loop to run while I is less than 5, which means that on every iteration, it's going to check to see that I is less than 5. And if I is less than 5, then the code inside this code block will be executed. And currently what we're doing in this code block is just increments the value of I. So this will keep happening until it gets to the point where I is no longer less than 5, and this will stop and return I for us. So that's what this function is supposed to do. I'm going to deploy this again so we can test it and see the exact outcome. So I deployed the smart contract over here. Just going to open the Explorer so that we can see more of the transaction. And this is the smart contract we just deployed, the second version of it. As you can see, we still have our for loop and the state that we defined for the for loop. And then we have the while loop. So let's just test the while loop. And then this while loop is supposed to return a value when we call it. And we expect the value to be 5 because on every iteration, I is going to be increased from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. It just keeps getting incremented until this condition is no longer met. So when I call the function, as you can see, it's going to return 5 because it took 5 incrementations to fulfill the while condition. So loops are an important part of any programming language, and Solidity is no exception. The for and while loops allow us to repeat a block of code multiple times, which is essential when writing smart contracts. By understanding the syntax and functionality of these loops, you can write more efficient and effective smart contracts in Solidity. Some important tips though: you need to be cautious with infinite loops. Ensure that the loop condition eventually becomes false, otherwise the loop will continue indefinitely, consuming unnecessary gas and potentially leading to out of gas errors. Also, you must avoid modifying loop variables inconsistently, as it can result to unexpected behavior or infinite loops. So that's it. You now have basic understanding of how to use the for and while loops in Solidity. These loops are essential for repetitive tasks and iterations over data structures in smart contracts. Do well to practice using them in Solidity projects to ensure their functionality and flexibility. Thank you for watching the video. Please do well to like and subscribe. I'll see you some other time. Bye-bye.